The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum. Written by Heinrich Boll. Introduction. The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum is set in 1974 and examines the fraught political atmosphere and the sensationalism of tabloid news in West Germany in the late 1960s and 1970s as the conservative government and media clashed with the emerging leftist movements of the era. One of the novel's focuses is the paranoia over Red Army faction terrorism that gripped West Germany in the 1970s. The Red Army faction, a West German far-left militant group, was founded in 1970 in retaliation against what its founders described as a fascist state. Over the course of its nearly 3 decades in operation, the group carried out a series of bombings, kidnappings, bank robberies, and assassinations. The group emerged out of the left-wing politics that many youths adopted in West Germany in the late 1960s in response to the general distrust of authority that arose from the legacy of Nazism. West Germany's leftist youth population harbored anger over the process of denazification that West Germany and East Germany underwent after World War II, a process they felt was inadequate, citing the real or suspected Nazis who continued to hold positions in government after the war. Radical leftists also took issue with West Germany's conservative media, which they felt was biased toward imperialism and Nazi sympathizers. At the time, conservatives owned many of West Germany's most highly circulated tabloid publications. At the time of Katharina's publication, conservative Alex Springer controlled many of the nation's most highly circulated tabloid papers, including Bild Zeitung, which the news of Boll's novel is transparently modeled after. Chapter 1-10. There are 3 major sources for the case of Katharina Blum: the police interrogation, Blum's attorney Hubert Blorna, and the public prosecutor Peter Hach, who went to high school with Blorna. There are also various documents from the police investigation. Most of the case will remain fictitious, though, because of the attitude of the accused and the awkward position in which Blorna now finds himself. For these reasons, any details Hach gets wrong are entirely understandable. In the next chapter, this report is a compilation of numerous different sources, so it may strike the reader as somewhat fluid from time to time, and it's only natural for there to be stoppages, blockages, siltings, and unsuccessful attempts at conduction throughout. In the next chapter, the report presents the facts of the case. On Wednesday, February 20th, 1974, on the evening before the opening night of Carnival, a 27-year-old woman, Katharina, leaves her apartment to attend a dance at someone's home. 4 days later, the woman knocks on the door of Crime Commissioner Walter Moding's house and confesses to killing the journalist Werner Tages, whose body is still in her apartment. She spent the past 7 hours walking aimlessly around the city, trying but failing to feel any remorse for her crime. She says she wants to be with her dead Ludwig. Moding knows the woman from various statements she's given over the past week. He drives her to police headquarters and tells his boss, Chief Crime Commissioner Biesman, about the situation. In the next chapter, at first, police thought that Blum was also responsible for the murder of press photographer Adolf Schoner, whose body was found in a wooded area on Ash Wednesday. Blum, after all, had just as much motive to kill Schoner as she'd had to kill Tages. But Blum had a watertight alibi, and there was no trace of her in his apartment. In the next chapter, one of the lead Carnival officials, a wine and champagne dealer, was relieved to discover that the murders took place on Monday and Wednesday, respectively. It would be bad for business if they'd happened on Tuesday. In the next chapter, the news, the murdered men's employer, reacted oddly to the murders, enthusiastically printing front-page stories about the killings. The murder of a journalist, after all, is more important than the murder of, say, a businessman. Other newspapers reacted similarly, with one even calling Tages a victim of his profession. In the next chapter, Katharina's apartment is cleared out after the murder and found to be worth approximately 100,000 marks. Meanwhile, Tages and Schoner are buried. Tages's funeral is a grand affair, but Schoner's is more casual because he wasn't a so-called victim of his profession. In the next chapter, the report details Katharina Blum's activity leading up to the murder. Dr. Blorna, before leaving for vacation, gives her 2 weeks' worth of wages to entice her not to take on extra shifts during Carnival, which is what she has done in years past. Katharina tells Blorna and his wife, Trude Blorna, that she plans to go to a dance at the home of her godmother, Else Woltersheim. She was already at the dance by 7:25 and traveled there via streetcar, a detail that will become important later on. In the next chapter, Katharina Blum didn't know it at the time, but she was under police surveillance the night of the murder. Later, she will admit to dancing the night away with a man named Ludwig Gotten. In the next chapter, looking back, it's critical to thank public prosecutor Hach for supplying the information that both Blum's and Woltersheim's phones were tapped as soon as Blum left Woltersheim's house with Gotten the night of the murder. Beesman requested the phone taps the way he always did. He called his superior and asked for plugs. Chapter 11 to 20. According to Hach, Gotten makes no phone calls from Blum's apartment once they return there after Miss Woltersheim's party. That night, the Beesman eventually gets bored. The following morning, he orders the 8 police officers who've been monitoring the apartment to break down the door. They find Catherine inside alone, wearing a floral housecoat. Curiously, she almost seems to be expecting the raid. Later, she will tell police that Gotten left early that morning without saying goodbye. In the next chapter, now it's important to mention a controversial question that multiple investigators put to Katharina, though Beesman is the first to ask it. Dr. Blorna, looking back, will guess that this question might be the reason that Katharina, who was extremely reserved to the point of being prudish, became so irritable and uncooperative. Did Gotten fuck her? Katharina said he didn't. The report speculates that it may also have occurred to Hach himself to ask this question, or even have sex with the attractive young woman. In the next chapter, after the police break down the door to Katharina's apartment, they search the place, confiscating a few items. They allow Katharina to get dressed, though they monitor her closely. They also allow her to pack an overnight bag. She repeatedly asks what she's done wrong. At last, the policewoman Pletzer tells Katharina that Ludwig Gotten is wanted for a bank robbery and possibly a murder. In the next chapter, the police escort Katharina Blum out of her apartment at 11:25 that morning. They decide against handcuffing her, though Beesman wanted to. Schauner is there and takes pictures of her from all angles. Katharina, humiliated, tries desperately to cover her face, resulting in photographs in which she looks angry and disheveled. In the next chapter, at police headquarters, Katharina gives a recorded statement. She explains that she was born on March 2nd, 1947, in Queer. Her father, a miner, died at 37 of an injury he incurred during the war. Her mother, Mrs. Blum, struggled to collect his pension and had to take odd jobs to make a living. Katharina worked too. She left school in 1961, and her godmother, Else Woltersheim, got her a job as maid for the Gerber's butcher shop in Queer. After that, she worked various housekeeping jobs. She briefly worked as an aide for a doctor, but had to quit when the doctor kept hitting on her, which upset the doctor's wife. In 1968, Katharina's brother Kurt introduced her to a textile worker named Wilhelm Bretlow, whom she married a few months later. But Katharina grew bored of her husband only 6 months later and ended up divorcing him. After that, she stayed with Else Woltersheim until she found work as a live-in housekeeper for a man named Mr. Finnern. But Mr. Finnern was arrested for tax evasion later that year. Mr. Finnern allowed Katharina to continue living in his home, and she visited him all that year until he was moved to a real prison due to new charges brought against him. After that, Katharina works as a housekeeper for Dr. and Mrs. Blorna, whom she met through Mr. Finnern. Dr. Blorna and Mrs. Blorna help Katharina take out a loan on an apartment. Katharina lives frugally, taking on extra catering work to supplement the salary the Blornas pay her. She's eventually able to purchase a car, a Volkswagen, which she uses to travel to catering jobs outside town. In the next chapter, Katharina's interrogation begins at 11 o'clock and ends at 5:45. During the brief lunch break, she refuses to accept food or drink from the officers. Despite Beesman's relaxed, friendly demeanor, Katharina insists on spending the lunch break in her cell. She eventually accepts a slice of cake, and tea a policewoman brings her from a nearby cafe, but she insists on paying for it herself. The policewoman decides that Katharina has no sense of humor. In the next chapter, After the first portion of Katharina's interrogation concludes at 5:45, officers debate whether to continue immediately or to pick things up later. Katharina agrees to continue, as Beesman told her she was free to leave once the interrogation is finished. She describes the night of February 20th. The dance at Miss Woltersheim's was the first official dance she'd attended in 4 years. She used to occasionally dance at the Blorna's parties, but the men there would get drunk and try to flirt with her. She admits to dancing with Hach, who blushes in response. No one asks Katharina if Hach was one of the men who tried to hit on her. In the next chapter, the interrogation lasts so long because Katharina is extraordinarily picky about language. She gets into an argument with Beesman, for instance, when he describes the behavior of the men who hit on Katharina at the parties as amorous. According to Katharina, amorous implies that she reciprocated their actions, something she fiercely denies. In the next chapter, the police also question people in Katharina's apartment building. Most have little to say about her other than that she was kind and always appeared put together. 2 neighbors confirm that a man would visit Katharina every few weeks or so. Hach, during Katharina's interrogation, delicately tries to ask Katharina details about the man. Beesman's style of interrogation is more blunt. When he accuses Katharina of knowing Gotten for 4 years, Katharina insists she only met him last night. Eventually, she gets frustrated and demands to be taken home. Beesman arranges for an officer to escort Katharina home, but he vows to get to the bottom of Katharina's history with Gotten. In the next chapter, Moding, who drove Katharina home, later tells Beesman that he's worried that the young woman might do something desperate. She seems really upset over the ongoing investigation. Ironically, though, she also seems to have developed a sense of humor. On the drive back, Moding explains, he joked that it might be nice for the 2 of them to go out for dancing and drinks. She laughed and agreed. When they arrived at her apartment and he offered to escort her upstairs, she declined and then jokingly suggested that she clearly has enough gentlemen callers. Moding tries to convince Beesman that Katharina should be brought into police custody for her own protection. He doesn't believe in Beesman's theory that Katharina is involved in some major conspiracy with Gotten. Beesman refuses, though, and accuses Gotten of being in love with Beesman. He later finds out that Moding gave Katharina 2 pieces of advice before dropping her off at her apartment that night: not to use her telephone and not to look at the news the next morning. It's unclear whether Moding meant all news or just the news. Chapter 21 to 25. Around 3:30 in the afternoon on Thursday, February 21st, Dr. Blorna is on vacation, getting ready to go cross-country skiing, when a reporter for the news, Tages, approaches him and starts hounding him with questions about Katharina. The reporter asks if Blorna thinks Katharina is capable of committing a crime. Blorna, confused, insists that Katharina would never do anything illegal, and he's shocked when the journalist explains her apparent involvement with Gotten. The journalist pesters Blorna with questions about Katharina, but Blorna refuses to answer. When he declines to comment on Katharina's character, the journalist warns him that this could be construed as suspicious. Hearing this, Blorna offers the first description he can think of, calling Katharina a cool, intelligent, and level-headed person, though none of this is true. The journalist, Tages, finally leaves. Dr. Blorna returns to Mrs. Blorna, who is equally worried about Katharina, and urges her husband to call and make sure the young woman is okay. Blorna calls Katharina repeatedly, but she never picks up. In the next chapter, the next morning, the Blornas see Katharina's name and photograph on the front page of the news. The story describes her as the outlaw's sweetheart and accuses her of helping Gotten flee the police. The journalist has also twisted Dr. Blorna's comment about Katharina being cool, intelligent, and level-headed, describing her instead as ice-cold and calculating. The Blornas decide to cut their vacation short to be with Katharina. At the airport, Dr. Blorna reconstructs the events of that day. Luding called him, urging him to get in touch with Alois Strobelder, a conservative politician whom Blorna represents. Blorna does so, and a concerned Alois asks Blorna to represent him in a very delicate matter. Katharina also calls Blorna to ask if he really described her the way the newspaper article said. Blorna insists he didn't, and Katharina believes him. She knows how those journalists work. In the next chapter, Katharina is on the front page of Saturday's paper, too. The news headline reads, "Murderer's Mall Won't Talk," and the story claims that Katharina is covering forgotten. Dr. Blorna appears in the story, too, described as Katharina's attorney. The Blornas arrive home to a telegram from Alois, who expresses his disappointment in Dr. Blorna for letting him down. Mrs. Blorna reads the story and laments that Katharina's life will never be the same again. If the police don't get to her, the news will. The story apparently contacted Katharina's ex-husband, who suggests that Katharina must have divorced him to be with Gotten. He insinuates that Katharina left him because she knew an honest man wouldn't be able to fund the lavish lifestyle she desired. The article also quotes Berthold Hieperts, the retired high school principal for whom Katharina used to work. Hieperts describes Katharina as a radical. When Dr. Blorna calls Hieperts to ask about this, Hieperts claims he only called her radically helpful and smart. In the next chapter, now it's time for a flashback, as movies and books call it. The action rewinds to Friday, when Katharina returns to police headquarters for her second interrogation. Everyone who attends the interrogation is struck by Biesman's exceptionally good mood. He's immensely cheerful and effusively apologizes to Katharina for treating her poorly the previous day. Then Biesman goes through the items the police confiscated from Katharina. These include a green notebook containing only telephone numbers, bank statements, another notebook detailing Katharina's expenses for herself and for her various employers. Biesman fixates on the odometer readings Katharina recorded in the second notebook. He claims that Katharina's heavy mileage is suspicious, suggesting that she was driving to see Gotten. Katharina calmly explains that she likes to drive around town after work. She doesn't want to be the kind of lonely woman who just sits around home watching TV into the night. Finally, Biesman removes a ruby ring from his coat pocket and asks Katharina if she recognizes it and knows how much it's worth. Katharina says she recognizes the ring but doesn't know its value. She assumes it can't be worth all that much. Biesman says the ring is very valuable, worth between 8,000 and 10,000 marks. He accuses her of getting the ring from Gotten. It's clear to everyone in the room that Katharina was genuinely unaware of the ring's worth, and that the questions about Gotten have embarrassed her. She calmly explains to Biesman that she hadn't known Gotten before she met and danced with him at Miss Woltersheim's party. She claims that she and Gotten felt a mutual attraction and spent the night together, but that was all. When Biesman asks Katharina why she didn't drive her car to the party, she says she was merely looking ahead and figured it would be safer not to drive if she ended up having a bit too much to drink. Biesman claims this is suspicious, as Katharina earlier claimed that she rarely drank too much. In the next chapter, now it's time to address why Biesman and Katharina were both so calm during this second interrogation. While that morning's news article had certainly infuriated Katharina, she felt better after clearing things up with Dr. Blorna. More importantly, though, Ludwig called her that morning at Miss Woltersheim's. The couple had a sweet, romantic conversation, though Katharina had expressly warned Ludwig not to say anything about love. And Ludwig told her that one day he'd return for her and they'd go away together. Unbeknownst to Katharina, who doesn't know that Miss Woltersheim's phone is being tapped, this phone call is the reason for Biesman's calm mood, too. He also knows about another phone call, an anonymous one. Chapter 26 to 30. It must be noted that both Miss Woltersheim and Dr. Blorna are aware that Katharina did commit an offense by helping Ludwig Gotten leave her apartment undetected. It's also important to know that Katharina admitted to Miss Woltersheim that she was so smitten with Gotten that she'd be willing to have children with him, even if she had to wait years for him to complete his prison sentence. In the next chapter, with Katharina's second interrogation complete, it's now time for Biesman to speak with Miss Woltersheim and find out how, exactly, Gotten came to be a guest at her party. Katharina opts to wait in a cell while the police speak with Miss Woltersheim. She also asks if there's anything the government can do to protect her against the horrible stories the news is publishing about her. Hach explains that, given the seriousness of Gotten's crimes and Katharina's role in helping him escape, the police will have to issue a press release. Also, her simply knowing Gotten makes her a public figure. Hach does think that Katharina may be able to bring a private lawsuit against the news for certain slanderous details included in the stories. A policewoman named Renata Zundak is assigned to guard Katharina while she waits for Miss Woltersheim. She later reports that Katharina declined all offers of food and drink and did nothing but reread the news stories over and over again. Realizing how upset Katharina was about the news stories, she fetched clippings of other news publications that had covered the story to show Katharina that most coverage had been professional and objective, with many only using Katharina's last initial. This doesn't comfort Katharina, though, because everyone she knows reads the news. In the next chapter, Miss Woltersheim is far more hostile than Katharina during her interrogation. She is infuriated by all the news coverage of the affair. Although she accepts that the police have a duty to investigate Katharina's role in Gotten's escape, she doesn't think Katharina deserves to have her life ruined over what she did. Woltersheim then explains that she didn't invite Gotten to her party, nor did she know his name. He arrived with other people. Miss Woltersheim insists to Biesman that she knows everything about Katharina's life, though she admits that she was unaware of all the so-called mystery drives. Catherine did have a gentleman caller, not Gotten, whom Miss Woltersheim describes as corny. She supposes that Katharina could have been driving to see this man, though she says she'll have to check with Katharina before sharing more details. Miss Woltersheim promises Biesman that Katharina is a thoughtful and hard-working woman who regularly attended church growing up. Miss Woltersheim returns to the subject of all the press coverage, demanding that somebody press criminal charges. Biesman says there's not much they can do other than bring a private suit against the news. The freedom of the press isn't a subject the government takes lightly. When pressed on whether Katharina's mysterious gentleman caller could have been Gotten all along, Miss Woltersheim admits that she's never met the suitor personally. She also defends herself for not being more suspicious of Gotten at the party. Karl, a man who attended the gathering dressed as a sheik, had seemed at least as suspicious as Gotten. In the next chapter, Hertha Schummel, the 17-year-old who brought Gotten to Miss Woltersheim's party, is the next person police interrogate. Hertha explains that she is distantly related to Katharina and Miss Woltersheim and thinks of them as a cousin and aunt, respectively. She explains that she and her roommate Claudia met Gotten, and later, Karl, when they were dancing at a cafe near Miss Woltersheim's. Hertha insists she didn't know about Gotten's criminal past. At the cafe, he claimed to just be passing through town. She and Claudia invited their new male companions to the party, and the men accepted. Hertha admits to being surprised at how quickly Katharina took to Gotten, as Katharina is normally quite reserved. She also confirms that she called Katharina the day of the party and mentioned her and Claudia's plans to find some men at the cafe to attend the party with them. In the next chapter, Claudia is interviewed next, and she confirms the details of Hertha's story. And she, too, claims to have been surprised by how friendly, perhaps even familiar, Katharina acted around Gotten. Chapter 31-40. There are 3 more party attendees to interview: Conrad Beiters, George Plotin, and George's wife Hedwig. Their accounts of the evening match, and all 3 recall having a nice time at the party, though they admit to being upset that Gotten was monopolizing Katharina's attention. They, like Miss Woltersheim before them, recall Karl talking to himself in the bathroom and then leaving without saying goodbye. In the next chapter, Katharina is called back in for questioning. She confirms having spoken on the phone with Hertha, but denies the suggestions of Korten, another public prosecutor, that she then called up Gotten to arrange for him to cross paths with Hertha at the cafe and get her to invite him to the party. In the next chapter, Korten revisits all the evidence the police have gathered through their investigation, looking for gaps in the story. He notes that Karl, the man dressed as a sheik, seems a bit suspicious, and he wonders aloud to his colleagues whether it's worth looking into him. This prompts a smile from policewoman Pletzer, who says it should be obvious to Korten that Karl is one of their own. The police had a whole team of undercover officers dressed in carnival costumes monitoring Gotten's movements that day. The police decide to release Katharina to go about her business as usual. They'll closely monitor her with the hope that she'll eventually make a mistake that will destroy her cover. They also hypothesize that Mrs. Blorna, Trude the Red, might have something to do with orchestrating Gotten's escape, having designed Katharina's apartment complex herself. In the next chapter, Miss Woltersheim and Beiters escort Katharina back to her apartment. Undercover officers, One dressed as a sheik and the other dressed as an Andalusian woman, watch them from afar. Catherine goes straight to her mailbox, desperate to see if Gotten has contacted her and apparently discovering that he has not. The phone rings almost immediately once they walk through the door. Katharina picks it up and hears an unfamiliar voice on the other end calling her a filthy, cowardly bitch. Miss Woltersheim ends the call and then carefully keeps the phone off the hook. Katharina looks through her mail and finds nasty postcards and letters. Some are crude, while others accuse her of being immoral or a communist. Fortunately, Miss Woltersheim intercepts a letter that Katharina's neighbors apparently slipped under the door before Katharina could read it. In the letter, the neighbor berates Katharina for turning down his sexual propositions and threatens to force his happiness on her. In the next chapter, before Miss Woltersheim and Biters leave from dropping Katharina off at her apartment, they watch in silence as Katharina calmly picks up half-empty bottles of liquor, medicine, or condiments and throws them at the walls. In the next chapter, there have been many theories as to which event led Katharina to decide to commit murder. It might have been the Thursday the first news article was released, or it might have been the articles released the following Saturday or Sunday. Even if neither of these subsequent articles was the trigger itself, their publication can't have made matters any better. In the next chapter, before returning to the story's present, Saturday, it's important to revisit one last detail of Friday evening and Friday night at Miss Woltersheim's, during which Conrad Biters put on some records and tried to get Katharina to dance to cheer her up. Miss Woltersheim and Biters try to get Katharina to make decisions about what to do going forward, like whether she should consider getting a new apartment, but Katharina is evasive and only mumbles about wanting to make a carnival costume. Later, Katharina is so exhausted that she falls fast asleep, not even waking to the telephone ringing at 2:30 in the morning. Biters takes the phone from Miss Woltersheim and briefly speaks to the person on the other end before hanging up the telephone. It's now that Miss Woltersheim and Biters decide to shield Katharina from the subsequent news articles. In the next chapter, now, it's Saturday morning at the Blorna's house. The Blornas are exhausted, having just arrived home from vacation. Dr. Blorna calls Hach, whom he's known for over 20 years. They attended school together. Hach is grumpy, irritated that Dr. Blorna has called so early in the morning, but he relates vague details about the case. Yes, the police have some incriminating details that don't look great for Katharina, but it's not the strongest case. Later, Mrs. Blorna wonders whether Aloys's ongoing delicate matter has anything to do with Katharina. Could he be the mysterious gentleman caller Katharina had been seeing before she met Gotten? Mrs. Blorna also realizes that she is indirectly responsible for Gotten's escape. Katharina had taken great interest in the construction of her apartment complex, which Mrs. Blorna designed, carefully examining the blueprint that Mrs. Blorna has hanging from her wall. Suddenly, Mrs. Blorna is grateful she never gave Katharina her own copy. That would have given the police all the more reason to implicate Trude the Red in the fiasco. Mrs. Blorna's thoughts are interrupted, however, when the so-called gentleman visitor pulls up to the Blorna's house. In the next chapter, Aloys Straubalder pulls up in a fancy rented car. Trude greets him scathingly. "Hello there, gentleman visitor." Aloys insinuates that Mrs. Blorna's guess is correct. Then he and Dr. Blorna head into Dr. Blorna's office to discuss Aloys's ongoing predicament. In the next chapter, Aloys confirms with Dr. Blorna that he is Katharina's gentleman visitor, and he admits to gifting her the ruby ring. He also confirms that the investigators found an envelope full of letters he sent Katharina. Now, Aloys demands that Dr. Blorna help him. He's not worried about the news. Looting has ensured that this won't be an issue. It's the other papers he's worried about. While he doesn't mind them publishing stories about his affair with a beautiful woman like Katharina, he takes issue with being tied to a criminal like Gotten. Aloys reveals the issue he's most concerned about. Acting on sentimental impulse, he explains, he gave Katharina a key to his country home in Kolforstenheim, perhaps hoping they'd one day spend some time there together. Now, Aloys is worried that Katharina may have given Gotten the key and that he's hiding out in the country home. Dr. Blorna suggests that maybe Aloys call the home to check, but Aloys doubts Gotten would pick up the phone if he's there. Trude enters the study just then and announces that the authorities have caught Gotten. They found him in Aloys's garden in Kolforstenheim, which the press is describing as the super-luxury villa of one of Luding's cronies. Apparently, Gotten shot at the officers, who shot back. She also says that Ludwig Gotten is, in fact, a true gentleman. Upon his capture, he immediately informed officers that Katharina had nothing to do with his crimes and that their relationship didn't go beyond an innocent love affair. Aloys's name hasn't appeared in the newspaper articles much, Trude says, but she suggests that Aloys go home and comfort his wife, Maud, now. Trude's scathing remark angers Aloys, but before he can respond, she drops another shocking detail. She has located Katharina. The woman is in queer Hoxacle with her mother, who died last night. Chapter 41 to 45. The narrator says it's imperative now to make a technical interjection before continuing on with the story, which, as it stands, has way too much going on. It's of course horrible to hear about a housekeeper who murders a journalist. But what does the audience make of a lawyer who cuts his vacation short to help a housekeeper? Or industrialists who simply force keys to country homes and themselves on this housekeeper, even though they themselves are unavailable romantically? And what does one make of these industrialists want publicity, but only of a certain kind? And what about the wiretappers tasked with listening in on the phone lines of an innocent person like Katharina Blum? And what happens when the wiretapper hears someone like Luding call up the news and tell them, S, write out, as of now, and B in? How would the wiretapper know that S stands for Straubalder and B stands for Blorna? And that while the news will print quite a lot about Dr. Blorna, they won't reveal much about Straubalder? Too much is happening in the foreground. In short, that we know nothing about what is happening in the background, and since it's a free country, people are allowed the privacy to say whatever they want to one another, even over the phone. What if the line of a suspect person of a vulgar nature is tapped? What sort of things might they say, and might the wiretapper be forced to hear? Where does one draw the line? In the next chapter, the story returns to the present. The news journalist Tages learns that Mrs. Blum, Katharina's mother, is currently hospitalized in Gimmelsbridge, recovering from a serious cancer operation. She'll recover, but it's critical that she not be exposed to any excitement whatever, and so her doctor forbids Tages from requesting an interview. When Tages argues that Mrs. Blum's indirect relationship to Gotten, via Katharina, makes Mrs. Blum a public figure, too, the doctor responds that even public figures are first and foremost patients. But this doesn't stop Tages. Noting that there are painters working on the hospital, he finds a pair of coveralls and disguises himself as a painter to gain access to the hospital. Then he visits Mrs. Blum for an interview, confronting her with all kinds of lurid details about Katharina's ongoing situation. Mrs. Blum didn't recognize Gotten's name and replied, "Why did it have to end like this? Why did it have to come to this?" But in Tages's article, he twisted her words to read, "It was bound to come to this. It was bound to end like this." Tages defends the edit, noting that as a reporter, it's his job to help simple people to express themselves more clearly. In the next chapter, of course, it's never confirmed whether Tages actually made this visit. He may have fabricated it, recognizing the critical importance of at least pretending to have interviewed Katharina's mother. The nurses at the hospital insist he would never have been able to pull off the scheme. In the next chapter, around noon on Saturday, February 23, 1974, Dr. Blorna and Mrs. Blorna, Miss Woltersheim, Biters, and Katharina gather at Café Klug in Queer for Mrs. Blum's wake. Erwin Klug, the café's proprietor, is a family friend of Katharina's. Dr. Blorna calls Hach and cancels the meeting they scheduled for that day, explaining that Katharina's mother had died suddenly. He blames Tages's visit for the death. Hach understands and tells Blorna to pass along his condolences to Katharina. And besides, he's very busy with Gotten's interrogation. Gotten, meanwhile, has spoken of Katharina with affection and not mentioned anything that would incriminate her. Katharina seems to be taking her mother's death well. Though she considers people like Tages murderers and character assassins, she acknowledges that it's just part of his job as a journalist who works for the type of newspaper the news is. After wrapping up at the cafe, Katharina views her mother's body at the mortuary. Only after leaving does she begin to cry. She quickly recovers and manages to thank everyone for attending the wake, and she remains composed for the remainder of the day. After, when her close friends are gathered in Erwin Klug's living room, she opens up about the situation with Strobelder, explaining how he'd insisted on driving her home after one of the Blorna's dance parties. He'd forcibly walked her up to her apartment, despite her protests, and continued sending her gifts and trying to make advances on her. This is why she didn't want to talk about the so-called affair with anyone. In truth, they had never even kissed, but she knew that nobody would believe that a woman like her would turn down being with a wealthy, important man like Strobelder. Katharina laughs as she describes how grateful was to finally put the key to Strobelder's country home to good use, though of course Ludwig Gotten would have no problem accessing the building without a key. She also confirms that she did help him escape through the heating duct but hadn't realized how serious a situation it was until the next morning. And she certainly hadn't realized that her apartment was being monitored. She's even glad about Gotten being arrested. It means he won't be able to do anything foolish from now on. She does, however, note how anxious that Beesman has made her. In the next chapter, the rest of Saturday passes without incident, and Katharina appears in generally good spirits. Dr. Blorna tries to convince her not to give an interview with Tages, something she previously consented to, but Katharina is adamant about going through with it. She even turns down Blorna's invitation to be present during the event. In retrospect, Blorna will wonder whether she has already decided to go through with the murder. But, of course, it could just as well have been the Sunday news story that sent her over the edge. Chapter 46 to 50. Katharina's evening after leaving Erwin Klug's is calm and unremarkable. She accompanies Miss Woltersheim and Biters to Miss Woltersheim's home, and everyone listens to the radio. Katharina puts some finishing touches on the Bedouin costume she made herself for Carnival. Later on, Miss Woltersheim and Biters finally go to bed together without being secretive about it. Katharina, meanwhile, falls asleep on the couch. In the next chapter, when Miss Woltersheim and Biters wake up the next morning, they find that Katharina has already made breakfast and coffee and is sitting at the table, reading the Sunday news. The featured story accuses Katharina of being cold-hearted and selfish, dancing the night away with a thief and murderer while her mother lay dying in the hospital. It also accuses Katharina of being promiscuous and taking advantage of a respected and married gentleman, Strobelder, accusing her of paying him unwanted visits and trying to ruin his career. Finally, the article claims that Blum and Gotten had known each other a long time and didn't just meet at the dance. In the next chapter, later, Beesman's colleagues will criticize him for waiting nearly 48 hours to apprehend Gotten at Strobelder's country home. Beesman will defend himself, arguing that Gotten was closely monitored and that it was advantageous to the investigation to wait and see if he contacted any associates, which he did. Beesman is also happy about the additional information he has gotten thanks to the news reportage, namely some critical details about Miss Woltersheim's past. It turns out that she is just as disreputable as Mrs. Blorna, Trude the Red, having been born out of wedlock. Her mother is still alive, in East Germany, and has asked Miss Woltersheim to return on numerous occasions, though she refused each time. Miss Woltersheim's father, Lum, meanwhile, was a member of the German Communist Party and emigrated to the Soviet Union in 1932. In the next chapter, the Blornas and people of their social standing generally read loftier publications than the news, and so Dr. Blorna has no idea about the story about Katharina that the news has run. He doesn't learn the details until Miss Woltersheim calls and reads the article aloud to him over the phone. At first, he cannot believe what he's hearing, and then he becomes so angry that he runs to the garage to make a Molotov cocktail, planning to throw it through the windows of the news office. He would have gone through with his plan, too, had Mrs. Blorna not stopped him. Meanwhile, Katharina waits inside her apartment for the interview with Tages, though the reader already knows how that will go. In the next chapter, Dr. Blorna goes to Gemmelsbräuch to confirm whether the pastor's claim that Katharina's father was a communist is true. He spends a day at the village, during which the pastor confirms the veracity of his claim, though he can offer no proof. Indeed, the pastor even claims he doesn't need proof. He had simply smelled that Blum was a communist. Later, when Blorna is on his way out, another villager, a retired schoolteacher, smiles patronizingly and accuses Blorna himself of being a communist too. Chapter 51 to 58. The narrator deems it necessary to reveal one or two acts of violence that occur as Dr. Blorna prepares his defense of Katharina. First, Dr. Blorna makes the mistake of agreeing to Katharina's request that he defend Gotten, too. Then, he makes another mistake, trying to get permission for Katharina and Gotten, who are apparently now engaged, to visit with each other. In retaliation against Blorna's over-involvement in the whole affair, the news publishes a series of pieces claiming that the Blornas are trying to get a divorce. The stories cite Blorna's money problems. Unfortunately, this detail is true. Blorna's career falls apart as a result of his involvement in Katharina's case, and he also loses a lot of money taking over the management of Katharina's apartment following her arrest. In the next chapter, Strobelder, meanwhile, calls Dr. Blorna to assure him that he won't let Blorna and Trude starve. Despite Dr. Blorna's failing career, Blorna still represents some important clients, but he's no longer a lawyer of international renown. The news continues to run slanderous pieces on the Blornas, falsely accusing them of having communist sympathies. In the next chapter, as Blorna prepares Katharina for trial, he's mostly concerned with her not testifying that her murder of Tages was premeditated, which will make her obvious lack of remorse seem all the worse. Katharina privately claims that she had thought about murder on Thursday after she first read the first news piece about her. Blorna tries to tell her that everyone thinks about murder from time to time, but that this is very different from actually planning to commit murder. Meanwhile, Katharina is considered a model prisoner around jail. She even seems happy to be there, as it means she's experiencing the same conditions as her dear Ludwig. However, she's not popular around the prison due to her reputation for integrity. This, the narrator suggests, is proof that integrity, combined with intelligent organizing ability, is not desired anywhere. In the next chapter, Hach suggests to Blorna that Gotten likely won't get more than 8 to 10 years in prison. This will likely be the amount of time Katharina serves, too. She and Gotten will be in their mid-30s when they get out, and Katharina is already making plans to open a little restaurant with the capital she'll have accumulated from her apartment during the years she's in prison. In the next chapter, whereas Katharina is happy with her future, else Woltersheim grows more unhappy, upset at the news for ruining the reputations of her parents. She grows increasingly asocial and fantasizes about throwing potato salad onto rich men or shoving salmon down the cleavage of rich women. In the next chapter, the narrator can vouch for only one instance of an actual exchange of blows, and that occurs during Dr. Blorna and Strobelder's first in-person encounter since all the present chaos began. They meet at the preview of an exhibition for a painter whom Blorna is supporting. There, Strobelder urges Blorna not to take it all so seriously. Blorna responds by punching Strobelder in the face. A photographer for the news is present and captures the incident on camera. Later, a story is published under the headline, "Conservative Politician Assaulted by Leftist Attorney." In the next chapter, as trial preparation moves forward, rumors spread that Dr. Blorna may be forced off the case due to his undue involvement. As it happens, Blorna is in love with Katharina, though it's clear she does not reciprocate these feelings, being totally smitten with Ludwig. More details come to light about how Katharina acquired the pistol she used to shoot Tages. It belonged to Conrad Beiters, who admitted to taking Miss Woltersheim and Katharina out into the woods on one occasion to do some target practice. It's theorized that Katharina had gone into his apartment on Saturday night, claiming she just wanted to be alone, and that's when she grabbed the pistol, which she then took back to her apartment to use on Tages. In the next chapter, finally, the narrator claims there is something reasonably cheerful to report: Katharina's story from her own perspective, which she has recently told to Dr. Blorna. Katharina describes the night leading up to her murder of Tages, the night she'd originally planned to meet with him for an interview. Katharina remembers how she took on some hours at a neighborhood bar frequented by journalists, bartending as she waited for Tages to arrive. He didn't show up, though, so eventually Katharina drove home and waited for him to ring her bell. Katharina describes hearing the bell ring, announcing Tages's arrival. When she opened the door to find him waiting there, He looked smug. Calling her Blumikins, he asked if they might start the interview with a bang. And this is what pushed Katharina over the edge. If a bang is what Tages wanted, she remembers thinking, then she'd surely give it to him. Katharina then shot Tages 4 times. As he fell to the floor, she remembers, he looked incredibly shocked. After the murder, Katharina returned to the bar to work some more. Then she left without saying goodbye. After leaving the bar, Katharina explains to Blorna. She went and sat in a church and thought about how miserable her life had become as of late. When she thought of Tages dead in her apartment, she felt no remorse. Finally, she went to Moding to turn herself in, remembering him as the police officer who had been so nice to her before. The moral of The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum is a critique of media sensationalism and its power to destroy lives, highlighting the importance of truth, justice, and individual dignity. Thanks for staying with us. Your support truly means everything.